Hi, I'm Amanda Morgan, and this is Not Just Cute, the podcast, where we discuss all kinds of topics to help bridge the gap that exists between what we know and what we do in early childhood education. We're starting conversations with academics, authors, decision makers, educators, and parents so that together we can improve the quality of early childhood education, while at the same time protecting and respecting the childhood experience. I'm so excited to have Sally Haughey as my guest today. You may be familiar with her amazing work through Fairy Dust Teaching, a site committed to respecting the whole child, community, play, and education as a living, breathing art form. She began the site in 2010 as a place to collect and share her own thoughts as an early childhood educator. In the 11 years since then, it has grown into a global community and has been the springboard for 2 books and multiple conferences and summits, all focused on the beauty and wonder and magic of early learning. Sally is a brilliant balance of down-to-earth accessibility and enchanting inspiration. I know you're going to love her. Before we begin, I wanted to let you know that I'm offering a free mini course covering 5 keys to intentional whole child development. I have really appreciated the positive feedback I've received on this project, both from individuals as well as from teaching teams looking to get on the same page with their intentional whole child approach. If you'd like to learn more about how to implement and advocate for developmentally appropriate, responsive early education, sign up for this free course in today's show notes. You can find those show notes for this episode at notjustcute.com/podcast/episode 44. Sally brings so much passion for early childhood education and is an absolute delight to talk with. I could have visited with her for days, but we worked really hard to keep it under the hour mark. I hope you enjoy it. If you're looking for ways to advocate for play and incorporate more wonder and curiosity into your practice, you are in the right place. Let's jump in. Sally, I am so excited to talk to you today. I've had you on my list. I've been wanting to talk to you for so long, and I'm excited that we've finally been able to make this happen.
Yes, I am excited too. You're on my list. I love that.
Well, I always love to jump in first by asking people about their professional path. I personally find it fascinating, and I've heard from other people that that's something that they, as professionals, are always curious about, how they can pursue the things they're passionate about and the different avenues that they can take. So I would love if you could share with us a little bit about how you got started, what you're doing now, and just some of that journey that you've taken.
Yeah, I love the question because, it's very distinct. I'm definitely an accidental educator. I was a fine artist, went to art school. And what brought my journey to a beginning was my son when he was in kindergarten. This is years ago, dating me, in the late 80s. And my son was very articulate, very, inquisitive, just to me, an extraordinary human being. And I got this call from his kindergarten teacher, Mrs. Jones. And she goes, I need to talk to you. Can you come in after school? So I went up to the school, went into the classroom, and her classroom, like in retrospect, is kind of interesting. It was very unremarkable, very ordered, some of the typical centers, but mainly chairs and desks. And she had this huge area of big computers. Now in the 80s, there were Macintosh,
right?
And they're like monsters. And if they fell on a child, they would probably have a lawsuit, so it was like overwhelming in that. But that was like this new initiative. And she invited me to sit down in this little chair in front of one of those huge monsters. And she was in the other chair. And the other thing I just love to point out that I think is so interesting in retrospect is that she had a blue suit on and heels. Now, any early childhood teacher that is play-based is like, whoa, that is a whole nother model of education. So I sit down, she opens this folder and shows me all these worksheets and says, your son cannot stay in the lines. His handwriting is not there. He scribbles. And she goes, and when he comes to the computer right where you're sitting, he falls out of his chair and cries. And when I ask him to get back into the chair, he has breakdowns and tantrums. She goes, I don't think he's ready to go on to first grade. And when I was sitting there, like I'm I'm hearing about an alien, right? Like, this is not what's important to me as a mother. My son is in deep conversation about the things in his life, about his friends, so I was like, okay, I got it. Went to the office, pulled him out of school and put him in the backyard to play. And he still remembers that as the best thing that ever happened to him. And I got this fire in my belly. Like, I know my son is extraordinary. Why is he failing kindergarten?
I love that.
And so I read John Holt. I was reading all these things as a mother. So all that happened. And then I was a church secretary, right? Like, at the Methodist church my family went to, I was a little secretary's assistant, to be honest, not even the secretary, but the assistant to the secretary. And I would, on those old machines, roll out the programs and sharpen the pencils for the pews and all of that. And as an artist, I loved the church, loved the people, but I needed to change. So Miss Martha, the beloved four-year-old teacher, comes in and tells the director who's in the office with us, I'm leaving. So I'm like, oh, this is it. This is my chance. So after Martha leaves the room, I said, Lana, I'll take the job. And she goes, well, Sally, what experience do you have? Ha, ha, ha. She knows. I said, none. And she goes, okay, we're going to put you on probation. Like, we'll give you a chance, but we have to see if you're really cut out for it.
We'll have our eyes on you.
We'll have your eyes on you.
Yeah.
What's so fascinating to me, and this is like, I think a real signal of how all of my path unfolded, and to this day still holds true. That first day in that classroom, when the children arrived, put their things up, had activities for them. Now it was time to come to the carpet and meet each other, right? I call out, time for the carpet, singing them to the carpet. And all 18 children looked at me with complete trust. Mm. And I was on my knees. Like, they completely are going to follow my word has power here. And in that moment, teaching was a spiritual path. Mm.
That's really powerful.
And it still is today.
Yeah. And to have that, you really have to be motivated by something, that drives that passion in whatever profession you do to really have an impact. So that literally gives me goosebumps to hear that. So you've go ahead.
And I'm just going to say the other thing about that, just to like haul that forward, all the 20 years of teaching. And now here I am, is as fairy dust, our mission, we're mission driven, mission over profit. Mm-hmm. And so the spirituality of what we do still trumps anything else that's out there. We will continue doing what we do, whether the marketplace wants us, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, because it's that kind of passion.
Yeah. And tell me about that spirituality. You use that term. Can you tell a little bit more? And I know that you are very mission driven, and how do you tie those two together? Tell me what that means to you.
So for me, so spiritually, and I take this very seriously. I will not speak about my personal path, because I want to honor all paths, right? Like, right. So I'm an inclusive human being. I feel like we're all on the road to the same place. So just to be very clear about that. But with the mission is that I feel I'm in service of young children globally. So what I feel is at stake, and this is like, I get teary-eyed every time I say it, is that I think the answer to our global issues lie in the children in early childhood, and us facilitating, play-based education done right facilitates the whole being of the child, mm-hmm. and prepares them for dynamic relationships, for lifelong learning, for collaboration, for all of those things that are so important for a full life.
Yeah. I'm so glad that you brought that up. And that wasn't even something in my notes. So I'm glad that it just organically came up, because it's something that I've spent some time thinking about and have written about, that I think because we want to respect those different paths. And I kind of make the distinction between a religious path and a spirituality, that they overlap. And we're so nervous about encroaching or pushing our own religious perspectives that we just get rid of spirituality altogether. When in reality, that there's, like you said, if we were looking at a holistic developmental perspective, or just as human beings, this holistic aspect, that we have to recognize that there is a spiritual aspect to that, like you said, there are many different paths, many different religious paths, but that there are these core truths of spirituality that is just part of being human. And that sometimes we neglect because we're afraid of getting too specific, but that we can kind of refine down to those core principles. And that's really appealing, not only in the way that you approach education, but the way that you're driven by passion as an educator and as a professional. So I'm glad that came up all by itself.
Yeah. And I love how you're speaking this, because it points to the heart of the matter, which is the dignity and honor of all human beings, children and teachers, parents, all of the community at large. When we bring honor and respect and the rights, hat tip, Reggio Emilia approach, when we honor the rights of the citizens, all citizens, it's profound. I consider the Reggio Emilia approach deeply spiritual.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
they don't say that, but I consider it deeply spiritual.
Yeah. And you can see where you have that draw, as you mentioned, you're an artist yourself, and this draw to the Reggio Emilia philosophy. Can you talk a little bit about that connection? In fact, you talk about education and teaching itself as a living, breathing art form. So can you talk about that tie between art and education and what that means?
So I love that question. And I think this is really an important one. And I think it's first really important to establish the existing model before we say what it means to be a living art form, a living, breathing art form. And I love Seth Godin, who's actually a marketing guy, but he wrote a whole manifesto on education that I think should be read by everyone. And he says, we have to think about what is school for, and that education, he asserts, is not the same as learning. Education is not the same as learning. So I love that. And he says education is about compliance and conformity, obedience, and that it was invented, and I know you probably have heard this, as a compliant factory workers, right? Like we're building the workers for the factories. There's a lot of history there, and a lot, like I'm simplifying, right? But I think it's really interesting when we look at this model and its impact on us now, that like my son, he went into kindergarten, processed in the assembly line in kindergarten. Whoops, didn't process, bring him back, process him again in kindergarten. Like there are these standards, and we do quality testing, and the workers, educators, are celebrated if they're really efficient. And they take that view of the brain of the child is empty, and we're going to put the information in, little Ben Hoy didn't get all the information he needed. Stay in the lines, reprocess, It's like, and I think it's important to look at even that, if that metaphor is rather simplistic. If you look at education curriculum, every child gets the same curriculum. Teachers are lauded for their efficiency. And even more important, which I think we as play-based educators face incredibly, is that inside the factory model, the parent's success is that the child complies and conforms, gets the good marks, goes to the great universities. Yay! You succeeded. So parents' egos are at stake in this model. Mm-hmm. And good and bad parenting can be judged by your child isn't conforming. Now there's something to be ashamed of. So, do you see any life in that model? Is it very life-giving?
Right. It's very, when you think of a factory model, that's a very inanimate, right? It's an object that we're exactly producing.
Because the child is a passive learner. They really we're coming from the framework the child is an empty vessel that needs to be filled, versus the mind is, I forgot the quote, but the mind is not an empty vessel, it's a fire to be kindled, And so I love to use the example as my of the living art form. My experience, a professor, Tom Manhart at the University of Tulsa, when I was in art school, he was my guide. And so what he did is he set up my relationship to clay as a form of self-expression. And he told me all the things I needed to know, like, okay, if you're going to build a three-dimensional object, you got to slam out the bubbles, right? And if you're going to fire it, if it gets too thin, it's going to break. And, it's going to go in the kiln, fire. You need to put it in this way. It needs a base coat afterwards. This is how you mix a base coat. This is the formula for glazes, on and on and on. Facilitating my relationship to have a dynamic, successful relationship with clay. And he did it brilliantly. He's like one of my favorite experiences, and he's since passed. So my heart, to Professor Manhart for all that he gave, is that he didn't tell me what my clay should look like. He gave me a safe place to fail, and I failed miserably. I mean, you should have seen some of the things I created. I did hand building and the wheel. My joy was hand building, but oh my gosh, how many disasters I had. He allowed me to experiment and assisted me as needed. And that's a living art form. That's what I see, that the child's coming fully loaded. They have these amazing experiences. They have these amazing ideas and theories, and they matter in the journey, and they actually are driving it. So with Manhart, I got to be the driver of my relationship with clay. And I still remember it every single day. I cannot tell you what my biology professor told me. But children, to be able to be honored, like to me, for a child to be seen, heard, and honored for their ideas in the educational process, what kind of catalyst can we be? I mean, that is something I want to get up in the morning and do,
to find that way to support and scaffold the process rather than having this passive process that we just do the same way every single time. And I find it interesting that you can find those examples of great teaching, not just in the early childhood classroom. Because as you're talking about Professor Manhart, I'm thinking of my high school math teacher who was brilliant at that, that would stand by the board and say, what do you think we should do next? And let us talk about it and try to figure it out and try something that was wrong and fail. And so those principles of letting the students have an active role and honoring even the failure, because that is part of learning and teaching, that's an important part of the process, that is something that, you can't script it out, right? You have to, and so that's what I think of when you talk about the art, that you can't script that out. You have to feel your way through it based on principle.
Exactly. And it takes a deep passion, right? So I feel like when we look at the factory mindset of school, the teacher's capacity really isn't necessary because it is scripted out. Like there was this whole idea several years back that we could get people into an auditorium and over 2 weekends prepare them for education.
Right.
Like, being an expert wasn't necessary. And you and I know it's an art form.
Yeah. Yeah. You take that, it's that blend, that perfect blend where there is a science to it. You have to understand those aspects, but then how to apply. I mean, I think that's you probably have the same situation where people then say, okay, so now what do I do? Or what curriculum do I use? Or give me the script, right? And you just saying, I can't give you the script. The script is there's no script, right? Or even if you want to go back to the science, that's one of my favorite things to talk about when people say, I want science-based. And I'll say, or evidence research-based, and I say, great. The research says there is no script. The research says be responsive. That's what the research says. That is the evidence.
Exactly. Oh my gosh. I love that. Yes. Yeah.
Well, in your work, you obviously have this passion for the wonder of childhood and that magic, those, the passion part, the spirituality part, the wonder and curiosity, those things. In fact, as you mentioned before, you refer to it as one of the rights of childhood, this wonder.
Yeah.
So talk to me about that role that wonder plays in child development and in education.
Yeah. So this is like really, my passion. And
Right.
I spend way too much time researching and, I
No such
geek
thing.
out. This is my geek point.
Yeah.
And this is where the science comes in. So we know play, right? Like it is a drive in every human being. I was walking in Paris past a park and I was listening to the children play. And I'm like, this could be in Tulsa, Oklahoma. This could be in, in India, it could be anywhere, right? So it's universal. And even the sound of children playing is universal.
Mm-hmm.
And, the research has been done. Children who cannot speak the same language can play.
Right.
Right. So there is something that I find, this is kind of my geek point at this moment. So I was thinking, okay, we'll say an infant, 3-month-old, sees the mobile or some objects fluttering, and there's this sense of wonder, wondering. I start tracking. A 6-month-old sees something they're interested in and reaches to grab it. That interest, that wonder, what is it? The 9-month-old taking a shiny object and seeing what is possible here, that wonderment, this wonder, interest, curiosity, whatever you want to call it, in my experience is what actually catapults play. And what I find fascinating is, like, if we look at the 3-month-old, the 6-month-old, the 9-month-old, as a parent, I delighted in that play and in that reaching, and I could see the fine and large motor skill development, the tracking of the eyes, all those things unfolding, even as a parent, uneducated. I'm like, yes, yay, here you go. It's like we're delighting. But yet at the time the child becomes very articulate, play is no longer valid. And yet it's actually the spark that unfolds all of that incredible development for learning and growth. And I think about my experiences in the classroom, how it was these moments of wonder, moments of heartfelt desire that were the most powerful in my classroom. And one example I'll give you is this little girl, Amelia. And Amelia was this little, like her whole family was like tiny, and she had really dark hair, but very light skin and very thin and a very little voice. I mean, adorable, just like, I always thought I should, do sketches because she'd be the perfect little next Eloise or something. It's like, I must make a book about Amelia. And Amelia, my principal, we had my classroom, 4-year-old classroom was right by the front door. And my principal had 2 collie dogs, different families would walk with their dogs. And Amelia was, every time she saw an animal, wah, let me pet you, love you. And one day she looks at me and says, my mom said I could never have a pet, and I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry, and gave her a hug, but she was confronted by pets every single day. So she had some emotional moments. Well, one day she comes in and she says, Mrs. Haughey, I have the most exciting news. Can I have a show and share circle? I said, absolutely. So when we all gathered, she goes to her cubby and pulls out this huge matchbox, and she opens it up and says, I have a pet. I'm like, you have a pet? This is exciting. And inside was a folded little Kleenex and an earthworm.
Oh my goodness.
With these, she had, and this was Amelia, she even authored little tiny books. Like, she loved everything tiny. She had a little tiny scribble that was the TV, and a little scribble that was the food. Like, she had this whole thing, and this little worm, and she shared Willie the worm, and Willie the worm went out on the playground and went up and down the slides. And, Willie was having a great day.
Fantastic time.
A fantastic time. And this was her expression, and that need to take ownership of a pet, her expression of that. And, really endearing. But the following week she comes back and she says to me in her little tiny voice, she said, "Mrs. Haughey." And I said, "What, Amelia?" She goes, "Did you know that worms need water?" Her worm had not survived. And, in that moment, to be really transparent, I was like, "Oh my gosh, should I have told her?"
Right.
I was so captivated by her imagination and her love of Willie that I didn't correct her, or I didn't instruct her. He had a home, and that was an important part of her narrative of Willie. And so, I looked at Amelia and I said, "Tell me, what are you feeling right now?" And she goes, "I really wish I knew what worms needed." I was like, okay. And having done the project approach and the research, I sent her to the library to do research on what do earthworms needed. Long story short, that drive for her to have a pet, getting an earthworm, the earthworm passing, ended up, we had an earthworm farm. We had all the worms, and then we went into gardening. That one desire she had ended up having this magnificent curriculum that went on for months. And it all came out of, so like we think of wonder and interest as being like, there's the Grand Canyon.
Right.
Yes. But it can also be, I want a pet, and I have a pet and it passed. I wonder, what does it look like to have worms?
Yeah.
Like it's rich in emotion, and all the children were so into, because here's this person who's lost their worm. They're all comforting her. She's researching. Now they all get a worm, it's like, it was just spectacular. And I think that's what education should look like. Honoring the social emotional in the room.
Yeah. And it takes that connection, that observation for you to notice what is important to her, what is capturing everyone else's attention as they're engaging, and interacting with her on that topic, and being willing to be flexible, right? And to follow some of those interests. I know as you were telling that story, it was reminding me of when I was teaching a first grade group, and, we had our theme, we were going to be exploring winter. And I asked them, "What do you wonder about?" I had in my mind, already, here are the standards, here are the things that we're going to cover. But I thought, let me ask, what do they wonder about? What are they curious about? And I was living in the Salt Lake City, Utah area at the time, where there's a lot of snow. And so when I said, what do you wonder about with winter? And they said, one of the children said, "I wonder, what is that white stuff on my dad's car after he drives in the snow? There's this white stuff stuck on it." And it's, in that area, they salt their roads so they don't get icy, right? And so the ice or the snow gets on the car and melts off, and there's that salt residue. So I knew, for every grown-up, there was nothing magical about that. To us, it's just another reason you have to go wash your car. But as soon as that one child mentioned, "I wonder what that stuff is on my dad's truck after it snows," all these other children are saying, "Yeah, what is that? What is that?" And it was just such a reminder. First of all, it sparked an activity I hadn't even thought of that we could explore, with salt and melting ice and evaporation, all of those things we wouldn't have otherwise explored. But it was such a reminder to me that there are so many times that we take for granted, right? What sparks wonder? Like you were saying, we think of these big, grand things that it would take to spark wonder. And so often it's this tiny little thing that we've taken for granted because we've been here for decades. And these young children will say, "That is amazing. I am so curious and I wonder." And we can just tell them, right? But to help them explore and discover is so much more powerful, to explore that question.
I love that. Yeah, that's exactly it. And I think it's exactly what you pointed to. It's these moments of real life that are so meaningful. And that's what draws the rest of the class in, is that it's so about life, about, like with Amelia's loss of the worm, all these stories of loss of their pets started popping up, and my grandma, and this, it's like all these
all the
conversations
connection
all start rolling in, and it's, it's amazing. Yeah.
So as we talk about this concept of wonder, and like you said, wonder, curiosity, there's so many things that could fall under that. I sometimes think that people think about those terms and it feels very ethereal. It's not something they can hold on to. It's hard to write down in your objectives. They will feel wonder today, right? Like it feels ethereal, which I love, because the title of your blog and the work that you do falls under fairy dust, which kind of conjures that same magic, right?
Yeah.
So what would you suggest to people to help all of us to take wonder from this fuzzy concept we can't quite hold on to and make it something that's very real in our classrooms?
Yeah, I love that question. So for me, wonder is, I'll put it this way. So we have eyes for sight, we have, ears for hearing, we have the sense of taste, the sense of smell, and we have this organ called the brain that I have is the sense of wonder. So I think it's actually like almost a sense, because again, in observing children, and this is where my research is going, and we can call it different things. I call it wonder. I think wonder sparks is like that sense of spark that leads into interest. But I think it starts with that, and that it is innate in us. So it's actually, as an educator, I'm in a state of wonder a lot. I might have children pulled to, like, I remember bringing a sensory table into my 4-year-old classroom. And for some reason, like, the children were pushing and shoving to get in. Like, it wasn't extraordinary, but for some reason I was wondering, what is it about the sensory table that is drawing all the children right now? Right. I'm really curious. What is that? Or I think it's that push to explore, that push to expand, that push to be in possibility, and I think there's a lot of science behind it. It's, and I don't know if that's a concrete answer,
right? And sometimes that is the answer, right? Like I said before, we're looking for these concrete answers when sometimes we're looking for the wrong answer, right? And as you're talking about those things, that you as yourself being in a state of constant wonder and curiosity, I think it's so important that we do model that as educators, but also really as citizens. That's something I've been thinking about a lot recently, is how important it is for us to continually be curious and wonder about things rather than being entrenched in, I guess, certainty, for lack of a better word, that even in our certainty, there's something to wonder about. There's something to be curious about, and to just constantly be thinking and wondering.
Well, and I think this really comes to play for me where the rubber hit the cement was in classroom management. That's where wonder provided me the biggest payoff, because I could say, oh my gosh. And of course I had assistants, and some assistants were from the factory mindset, we might say, that compliancy was the goal. And we'd be saying, well, Billy sure knows how to manipulate you, and I'd have to stand back and really go, okay, I'm going to observe the behavior that Mrs. B is seeing and see, what do I see? I wonder what's unfolding here, to be in a state of curiosity rather than reaction and fixing. And what happens in that is, it's just like if you have had a child of your own, no manual comes,
right?
And I have gone on Google, looking for manuals.
Where is it?
That manual? I want a manual. And likewise, we get a whole group of children and they don't have manuals. And so to give them the honor of treating them with the same respect I would want. And if I was having a breakdown, I wouldn't want someone to say to me, you're manipulating. It's like, no, I'm actually upset. And so I think when we began to get curious and began to really look at children through the eyes of, if this was, not that children had the capacity of an adult, but they deserve the respect of being a full human being now. So when we try to fix them, or I actually think a lot of classroom management is shaming, because if I did that, if my principal did that to me, I would quit.
Right.
Like the light system, it's like, put me on a red light in the lounge, I'm out of here.
Right.
And I'll probably be loud about it. It's like...
I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I think so often, when we talk about this as a topic, let's talk about wonder and curiosity. I know for me, and I think for a lot of people, we instantly go to this mindset of, it's curriculum, it's methods, it's how we teach with wonder, which is huge. That's a big part. But I'm so glad you brought up behavior and classroom management, because it's a huge part of that as well. That just as you're saying, that we have to have curiosity and wonder in that as well. That's something that I've worked with people about, and working with classroom management, behavior, positive guidance techniques. And that's one thing I'll always remember, is when people would say he was doing this, he was doing that for no good reason. And my challenge would always be figure out what the reason is, because I guarantee there is one, right? And that you just have to bring the wonder and say, I wonder why. Why would he act like that? Because we cannot fix it until we're willing to wonder, until we're willing to be curious about the source and the cause. It's that Maslow quote that I'll probably butcher, but that it's easy when you see every problem as a nail. If the only tool you have is a hammer, you'll see every problem as a nail, right? Yes. We're just trying to fix everything with the same thing. But when we're curious enough to look at it and say, oh, that's actually a screw. I need a different tool for this, because I was curious enough to see the detail. Now I can come at it with the correct tool. So I'm so glad that you brought that up, that wonder and curiosity is not just in, teaching the facts and the intellectual aspects, but also in the social, emotional, and the behavioral, that we bring curiosity and wonder to that as well, and model that, because it's not just, it's certainly going to help us in our classroom management, but it's modeling really for the long term. How do we interact with human beings? How do we show compassion? How can we bring curiosity to how people are treating us, so that we can respond with more compassion, right?
Oh, I love that. Yes, goosebumps.
Oh, well, I'm glad you're the one that brought that up. I had not even thought of connecting the two, that it is not just our teaching methods, but it's also in our behavior and
I think
management.
That's where it becomes a living, breathing way of being. It's a way of being. And this is like, to be really transparent, in 2008, I had a student that challenged everything in me. And I even tried method, green light, red light. I tried everything, because I just, I wanted to fix it. And it's really when I came up against the rubber on the cement that I would think, okay, because I had to wonder, what is the answer here? How can he was violent. So how can I integrate him as a community member and no one get hurt? Like that was my priority, safety. And I was just one time just thinking, I thought about, okay, if my principal put me as a red light, I would yell at him and leave. Right. Okay. If he said to me, Sally, take a deep breath, I probably, have to sit on my hands to keep from punching him, because when I'm really upset, don't tell me what to do.
Right.
And so as I began to unpack respect, I turned and I went, okay, now I'm going to observe him with the wonder of what is this behavior telling me? He can't tell me. I'm wondering, I'm curious. How can I decode this? I figured out if I stood behind his left side, and talked to him, just slightly back and like this, he could take anything I said. If I stood in front of him, in any other position, it's like silly things like that weren't so silly.
Yeah.
Strategy. It's like classroom management strategies at that time were like, having an open wound and just piling stuff on top of it. Right. It was not getting to the source of the issue. And he was a gift, because none of that was going to work.
Yeah.
It was that severe. It wasn't going to work. I had to get to the heart of the matter. And the heart of the matter was really simple. I'm here for you.
Yeah.
What can we do, buddy?
I think that's so beautiful. Like you said, when you get to the heart of the matter, that so much it's kind of like if you just keep rubbing the wound when you realize, you're making it worse, that really what you need is to back up and soothe it, right? that it's really being curious about what is the source, because you cannot change behavior until you're willing to look at where it's coming from and what it's communicating.
And he was one of those things that, I didn't get to have the positive feedback loop of seeing improvement. It was every day was a challenge. And, for all the, challenges that his processing brought him, right? That neurodiversity, which I love that term. There's such respect in that. So I love that we're growing in our terminology. And, the next year, he came to my classroom every single day and said, through a muffled voice, "Mrs. Haughey, can I take down your chairs for you?" I'm like, yes. The first day he did that, I was just like, tried not to cry hysterically, because I knew I was his safe place. Like, what an honor to be that for another human being. Like, I might not be able to, and I think it's that factory model to think that we're not good educators if they're not complying and conforming. Some children won't, but to love them and support them in their journey. Just like my son, he didn't read till nearly third grade. I had no question. He graduated like top of his class in the top 3 and is a CPA, making more money than we'll ever know. He just had different neurodiversity, and he was lucky he had parents who believed in him, didn't believe this system.
And it really covers all of human development, child development, right? Is that it really comes down to being curious about, what does this child need right now? What does this child need, and really contrast that factory model that you've been talking about, rather than saying, I'll tell you what they need right now. I don't care.
Sit down and listen.
I don't care who they are, where they've been, what's going on. This is what they need to do at this time on this day. But rather being informed by some of those, we take information, we recognize, okay, we can take this information, but now I'm going to take all that information and turn to the child and be curious about, what do they need right now? And how can I best support them and help them to grow? And take that information, use that as a filter, those lists or whatever we see, that's great information to work from. But when we actually come to application, we cannot miss the part of being curious about the child that's right in front of us, and how can we best be responsive.
And with that, which is, beautifully put, is that I think another element or value to education is spaciousness. So a child, so it's like when I was it made me flash about Manhart. When I was in pan building, I would apply too much pressure and things would fall, and it was just going to take time for me to figure out what the right pressure to achieve the right end with clay. It's really not as easy as it looks, right? So for some children, coming into a community may not be as easy as other children. And Tom didn't come over and lecture me on it. He gave me the space to figure it out. Maybe, at one point saying, you can have a structure to help hold it while it's drying, or maybe you can do this. But I think the same thing, children, humans, we need space to figure it out. We don't need the pressure of being efficient and fast in that factory mindset. The idea that, the behavior is going to be behind. What are we going to do?
And it's that space that lets us have that ownership. It comes back to that autonomy again, that we're supporting something, but letting them own it, rather than, like you said before, this is a reflection on me. It's about me, right? That's why I need to apply this pressure. But then reminding ourselves that they have this ownership, and to give them that space and to support them within those appropriate, you want to have those developmental boundaries, right? We're not talking about just free reign of all the things, but that that we recognize that there is so much. And I love that word spaciousness. I haven't thought of that before, but that there is so much space there that we need to let them own and have that autonomy within that. Such a great reminder.
And it reminds me too of like, and I taught first grade for 1 year. So you said you taught first grade, my hat's off. Like that's not my jam. Like there's so many, so many school demands, from the system. Like, I'm like, but I had a little guy in my first grade classroom who really did not deal well with community. And so, I set up, in dialogue with him and in honor of him, I ended up taking a closet door off and putting a chair. It was like a slipper chair, one of those nice little fluffy chairs. And, a space where I could still see him, but he got to be isolated, but it was per his request.
Mm-hmm.
And that he needed the spaciousness of not interacting, of not being in community, rather than saying, no, you have to be at your desk. Mm-hmm. He could go and do his work sitting in that chair. I think those kinds of things. And people go, well, what do you tell the rest of the class? What's really interesting is when you're in dialogue with children as full participants, they get it, And
when they understand that you're responsive to their needs as well. And again, it's modeling to them, right? How to see people.
Or, so are you, and if they say, I want to do that. So, okay, let's talk about that.
Make a plan.
Let's make a plan. Yeah.
I love that. Well, another thing that you have mentioned that I know that we both share quite a bit of passion for, and it's come up already, is about play. And so I wanted to make sure that we touch on this before we go, because I think it is so important. And I love getting so many different perspectives on what do you see as some of the current challenges that are facing play? What's getting in the way of play? And what are some of the things that you think that educators can be doing to make sure that we help preserve and promote play in our learning communities?
Well, I think it's the same timeless challenge we have that I think is directly related again to the factory model, is that parents are terrified their child's going to be behind. And now with the pandemic, over the last however many, year and some whatever, they're like learning loss,
Right.
And so I think really parent understanding and the way our system has parents, their child's success nailed to their, identity, that's the biggest challenge. And I think that what educators who are committed to defending play, we have to understand the brain science. So, I have grown in this, I'm constant. I don't consider myself an expert. I consider myself a co-traveler with educators worldwide, because I'm growing and I've really come to see, and I'm working on models. Like I'm in the midst of this right now to come out with how I'm committed that we have a model that we can show parents and it makes sense. So I think that that when children select, so let's say we're in a 4-year-old classroom, that the child select where they play, no population control. So the brain to understand, and I know some teachers are going to go, what? Right? You are crazy. But again, if you get up under the science of it, it's really important. Self-selecting is massive in play. It's not really play unless they're selecting. It's a hands-on activity, which is 100% better than a worksheet, 100%. But if it's play, they're selecting themselves and they're choosing where they go. And again, if you get under the limbic system, if you get under all of those neural pathways, this is the most important first step. Then that they're self-initiating, meaning let's say they go to they're looking at the classroom and going to blocks. Now I've had it where half the class goes to blocks. What am I going to do then, Sally? You know what I do? I expand that center. I honor it. And again, it takes a little work to really facilitate, because this is not a free for all.
Right.
Excellence in play-based education is a highly engaged educator, being responsive. Like you said, I love that word, responsive. And so that when they have the experience of going, I'm choosing blocks and I'm going to build a house for my Batman, right? So they're initiating their own ideas, planning, executing, in communication with their friends, et cetera. So that's huge. Again, the limbic system, it turns the light switch on for learning. they're highly engaged. And then self-actualizing. And that means I don't run over with my, when I was a public school teacher, so I totally get it. You built a house. Let's count how many blocks tall is it? So I can have my assessment. And when I interrupt that way and start asking questions, it takes away the purpose and intent, and it's there. So I think it's really understanding what happens, because play is one of the most powerful ways to build executive functioning in children. Another thing, a child will go to the blocks every single day. And I've heard it 1,000 times. I don't know what I'm going to do with Sarah. She goes to blocks every day. I'm going to have to start assigning centers. I think the really important part, like as I've gotten into the heart of all the research that's been out there for decades on play and what's being done now, is that we know that play builds executive functioning. A child who goes to the same center over and over again is building focus, sustained attention, going back and building upon the last day's activities. This is executive functioning, and building the neural pathways of that sustained attention. So interest, wonder, is that developmental piece that happens in play for children. When they find something, like people will go, oh my gosh, I couldn't believe it. Little Joni was at the Biedermeier Center for 45 minutes. I've never seen her anywhere 45 minutes, because it's fulfilling something within that child that we can't see, whether, we know on at least the most basic level, it's building important capacities of focus and attention and, flexibility of decision-making, all of that. And, on the surface, and I know there's a whole school of thought, and this is not where I'm at, is where the adults stay out of the way, because I was a public school teacher, not possible, right? Not a part of the program, but play-based education that allows children to self-select, self-initiate, and self-actualize, supported by scaffolding and the teachers giving their interest to the children's interests, is unbelievable. Unbelievable. I mean, there is a distinct difference in the children's learning dispositions going into first grade from kindergarten, or going into kindergarten from preschool. And I think we think being able to recite the ABCs or the sounds and all of that is, that rote learning is what's preparing them. It's actually the disposition.
So true.
Yeah. I think that's where the juice sits.
And I love, as you're describing these, when you say half the class goes to the block area, what a powerful experience that is. And as you're talking about all these things, there is they are counting the blocks as they're building with symmetry or all these different things, and they're communicating, and they're using executive functions and all of these things that you're talking about. And I just can't help but think, you were talking about the factory model and an obsession with efficiency. And I've actually in some of my trainings flipped that on the head and say, look how efficient play is. If you're right. So this one activity is hitting on way more than you could ever do with a worksheet. How much more efficient is that, right? To be able to say, look at play, look at how many things that, like you said, that we can't, those things that we can't see, those things that we can't put on a worksheet, but that are so very important and really have that longevity for helping in that, even the academic trajectory, but even in their life trajectory, those things you can't see and you cannot put them on a worksheet. How much more efficient really is it to bring in play where you can get all of those things together?
And I think exactly what you're saying. And if you ask, like we began the conversation, is what is education for? That question that Seth Godin asked himself, and this whole manifesto came out. If we're not committed to developing conforming, compliant, soldiers in the factory, then why are we educating? And what I heard in what you said is it's for building a life of fulfillment, giving children the skills to fulfill who they are in the world.
Yeah. And that's our bigger piece. And I love that you come back to that why and knowing what is really our purpose. And then that informs everything that we do. Well, I love talking with you, and then so much that I could just keep talking about it, but I want to, before I go, have you share a little bit about the virtual conference that you have coming up, because I'm sure there are other people listening to this saying, I could also listen to her talk some more. And so let's give them a place where they can spend some more time hearing more about this. So can you tell us a little bit about this conference that you have coming up?
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Yeah. So this is going to be our 8th conference. Been doing it since 2014. And absolutely every year I say this is the best one yet. And this really truly is the best one yet. It's the Free to Play conference and summit. And what I did beginning with the pandemic is I now have 24-hour access to each day for free, because again, my mission is to serve all educators. And this is that equity to make sure anyone who wants to take part can. And of course, we do offer lifetime access, but I highly recommend that you guys check it out. We have Stuart Brown, who is one of my favorite researchers on play, and his presentation blew my socks off. I mean, I am still reeling, and I'm not going to give it away, but it gave me so much to chew on. We have 𝐅𝐫𝐞𝐞, who talks about social emotional, again, mind-blowing conversation. We have so many amazing individuals. And really, I'm going to tell you, one of again, coming out of the pandemic, one of the things that's really important to me is bringing the honor to the educator. So we're not going to tell you the way you should be doing play, we're here to unleash who you are in the matter of play. And that's different from everybody, right?
Yeah.
So this is a support system for you to take what you need for your practice with no apologies, right? So I welcome everyone. Even if you're an educator who has to do worksheets, I welcome you. Even if you bring play for 15 minutes a day in a way that works for you, I'm in.
I love it.
I'm in.
I love it. And I have to throw in my 2 cents here, because as I'm listening to you describe this conference, I want to make sure people are aware these are world renowned. These names that she's talking about, these are top names when it comes to talking about play and education. And that's just an amazing opportunity to be able to listen to that. And the other thing I want to point out, as we were talking before we got started, and I was asking about this conference that you have, that this is not your first rodeo. Like you said, that you feel like every year is the best. That's because you've been doing it for a long time. And that, this virtual concept that a lot of us have had to figure out on the fly, you've been working with it and perfecting it for a long time. And so that's another great plus to bring that experience.
Yeah. And I think to that point, my team and I have, I am nothing without my team, tip my hat to my team. But we're really working hard to provide takeaway, actual application in the classroom, because many times you can hear a very inspiring conversation, but what does it mean, rubber on the cement? How do I put this into practice? And we're making those links and weaving that for you so that you can actually go, okay, that's one way it can look. Oh, that's another way it can look. So, so it's not just talking heads, because I think we're all a little zoomed out.
Yeah, that's true. Well, I am excited personally to jump in and be able to watch some of these great things that you're offering. So thank you so much. Thank you for taking the time to talk with me today, and for just everything that you're doing to support educators and children in childhood. It's just such a gift. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. That has been a blast talking to you.
Thanks again for listening to Not Just Cute, the podcast. You can find show notes at notjustcute.com/podcast/episode 44. There you'll find links to interesting tidbits from our conversation, including Sally's site, Fairy Dust Teaching, as well as links to her upcoming free-to-play summit, which I highly recommend. Don't miss this amazing free opportunity to learn from some really incredible speakers. You can pick and choose the sessions you tune in for, so even if you only have time to catch one presenter, it will be well worth it. You can also hit up the show notes for a link to the free mini course covering the 5 keys to intentional whole child development. Head to notjustcute.com/podcast/episode 44, or go straight to notjustcute.com/keys, KEYS, to get signed up and receive resources to help you implement and advocate for developmentally appropriate, responsive early education. I'm Amanda Morgan. You can read more on my blog and sign up for the Not Just Cute newsletter at notjustcute.com. And follow me on Facebook. That's facebook.com/notjustcute. I'm also fumbling my way through Instagram, so follow me there at Amanda_notjustcute. Thanks for listening today, and as always, thank you for standing up for children and for childhood.